At the syllabus video and went over the syllabus with me. If you have any questions, let me know. Send me an email, and I look forward to hearing what you hope to take out of the class. So this is going to be our first lecture, I guess, on assessment. And really, what I want to do is lay the foundation for why it's important to know about assessment. So the PowerPoint is attached to this module, so if you'd like, print it out, go along with it with me. This video will be posted throughout the semester, so you can always revisit it if that's helpful for you. So let's just kind of jump right on in. That's not it. There it is. So, foundations of assessment. So this is why we go over assessment. Now, assessment, when we talk about it, probably half of you are thinking about it in a really clinical way, like what is the problem when working with a client? Or what is the presenting issue? What is their level of functioning? Things like that. And those are all great questions. The other half are thinking assessment in terms of measurement in a much more standardized fashion. And both of those ideas are assessment, right? Assessment is a big umbrella term that includes anything that helps us measure something with our clients. So when someone comes into your office and they sit back and their arms are folded and they're looking away from you, and you determine they're having a bad day, or they seem defensive, or they seem upset, you have made an assessment. When you give someone the Beck Depression Inventory, right, a standardized instrument to measure depression, you have also done an assessment. When you observe a child in their classroom, or you observe a couple having an argument, when you do your intake or you're just having dialogue with your client, or in group counseling, when you're watching the dynamics, you're making a determination, right? So this semester we're going to be focusing half our time, the first half, on the standardized stuff, right? With psychometrics and reliability and validity, what makes an instrument an acceptable instrument to use. And then we're going to move into the practical, right? How to do a biopsychosocial, how to do a mental status exam, making diagnoses, assessing strengths and goals. And then there's going to be a point where the two kind of converge, right? When we look at intelligence testing and personality testing. So all of this stuff makes up assessment, and these are all things that fall within the scope of a counselor's ability to do. So, as I was saying, assessment means to measure something, right? And when your client first comes in, we get a baseline. School counselors, when you're looking at standardized test scores or previous grades in, grade levels, right? In third grade, the child made such and such grades. In fourth grade, they jumped up, they stayed the same, they went down. Behavioral observations, right? We're getting a baseline. Then we look at a change, right? And counseling is about change, right? We need clients to change, right? We can't have them be in the same place. They don't want to be there, right? Otherwise they wouldn't come to counseling, right? And then how quickly is that change occurring? And it's that piece, this magnitude piece. Let me get my handy PowerPoint pen here. Magnitude, oh my. That tells us this worked well, this didn't work well, it worked. It helps us determine what's going on. If I have 5 clients and I see that 4 of them are really benefiting from mindfulness training, right? And I'm asking at the end of every session, how are you going? And I hear them saying, oh, I got into it with my partner and I stopped and did some deep breathing and it really helped a lot. 4 of them say something to that effect, and one person says, it helps sometimes, but I kind of get the impression it's not helping them as much. A good question is, what's going on? Maybe the intervention is not for them, right? Maybe it's not a good time in their life to use that intervention. Maybe I did something different that day, right? But helping see the magnitude of the change. This is working very well. This is not. This is important. And for us, for counselors, we're really looking at the trifecta: behavior, thoughts, and feelings, right? School counselors, if you work with youth, you'd also be looking at school, like the school setting, grades, things like that as well. So I always thought this was kind of an interesting piece about mental health and assessment. A lot of times we're trying to measure something that we cannot directly look at, right? If I want to know somebody's weight, I put them on a scale, right? If I want to know somebody's height, I measure them. If I want to see someone's, not that I would ever want this, but if I wanted to look at somebody's cholesterol or red blood cell count or something, there's ways of doing that, and I get this hard objective number. But if I were to say, how much conscientiousness does a person have, or what is this person's intelligence, I can't just look at something, right? There's not this thing that just is there and that's the number, right? These things that I want to measure but can't look at directly are called latent constructs. And these are things like intelligence, personality, depression, anxiety, functioning, satisfaction, cooperation, communication, things like that. And so the way we measure them is we come up with a task or an instrument, right? So I want to see someone's level of intelligence. I can't just watch them. That's not sufficient. I can't ask them, what is your level of intelligence? So we made an IQ test. And through this person taking that IQ test, if they have a high IQ, this shows up as high. If it's a moderate IQ, it shows up as moderate, right? But it only shows itself as a function of their performance. Personality, how extroverted is a person, right? There's not something that I can draw from or just immediately look at. We give a personality test, and I like being the center of attention, or I'm talkative, I don't have a hard time making new friends and things like that. And that's how I can gauge that person's level of extroversion. And so that's kind of what we're doing in counseling, right? When you're trying to figure out, and this will happen, a person comes to counseling and you're trying to determine how bad is what they're telling me. And that can be tricky, right? Because that person might tell you in a lighthearted way about something very serious, or might very seriously tell you something that, after the dust settles, is not that big a deal to them anymore, right? So we're having to gauge these things. When a person says, I can't sleep, well, how serious is that problem? We can only determine that by asking questions and seeing how it interferes, how it manifests in their everyday life. I'd cover that slide. So when do we do assessments? Well, assessment, the number one rule is that it's always ongoing, right? You won't stop doing your assessment. We're always gauging change, right? So in session 1, a person's coming in, we're establishing that baseline, and then in session 2, you're asking, how are things since last week? And we start implementing our treatment plan and all those other things, and then we're kind of watching each week, how is it now? And it's as simple as saying things like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how often do you worry? And session 1, it might be a 10. Session 2, it might be a 10. Session 3, a 9. Session 4, a 9. Session 5, an 8. Right? We're assessing. It's always going on. If there's something clinical, like with symptoms, right? How often are those symptoms occurring, and what is the magnitude of those symptoms? How bothersome are they? If they're implementing changes, how happy have they been with those changes? What is their adjustment like with those changes? So we're always asking. So just to be clear, you're not ever just going to say once, hey, how's it going? Let's chart this, and never revisit it. Not that any of you would do that. So assessment, what does this process look like? And just to kind of illustrate how essential it is to the counseling process, is going over that initial information. their history with the problem, what have they tried, family structure, right? Who's in your life? What is your relationship like with them? Doing their psychosocial, medication use. All of this falls under the domain of assessment, right? So I just want to emphasize that so that nobody kind of gets lost in this idea of it's only test giving. In addition to your ongoing assessments, you might have times where you need to utilize an instrument or a test, right? You might need something concrete they might need something for their job, for legal reasons, insurance reasons, or, and this has happened to me more than the other reasons, sometimes your client is so lost in whatever they're going through and I can't quite determine, where are we going with this? Really, what are we struggling with? And so giving this assessment helps. Assessment is part of the counseling process and can be part of your treatment plan. So by giving some sort of assessment, I get information about what they perceive to be the problem is, I get more information about the client, and they get some insight on both of those things. When we give this, I'll call it a one-off assessment, this is a discrete test, right? And that's just a vocabulary thing, right? We say it's a discrete time period. So when someone comes in and they say, a couple comes in for couples counseling and one says it's really bad, the other says it's not so bad, and we're trying to figure out which way is up, I might use the relationship assessment scale, right? And I'm only going to use it once. I'm not going to give it to them week after week after week. Giving it to them this one time helps set that baseline. When someone comes in and they're struggling with body image issues and they kind of go back and forth and they don't know how to express themselves, giving a body confidence or a body image dissatisfaction scale can kind of help them articulate or help them understand, certainly help me understand what's going on. And I can use that to supplement what I'm picking up in my counseling process with them. Ongoing and discrete, right? So kind of tying this together. We're always tracking something. Take substance use, for example, and the same can apply to, study strategies, going to school, going to work, anything that is a habit that needs to break or be made, right? Someone might come in and says, I drink 4 beers a night and more on the weekend. The next session, we're asking, what was it like this week, right? We're asking all this. It's ongoing and discrete, right? Because I'm asking this very pointed question. We might track the number of fights a couple has or the number of times that they put into use the counseling strategies we gave them. School counselors and youth counselors, you might be looking at behavioral problems at school or increases in grade. In very extreme cases or in crisis counseling, you might be looking at the duration and number of suicidal thoughts. So we're always looking at things, right? It's, in a way, it's really kind of easy to hear yourself asking these questions of your client. Oh, it looks like I have some redundant slides in there. So the benefits of assessment include helping determine the client's problem, which I briefly talked about, and I'll go into more detail in a second here. It helps us conceptualize the problem. It helps us implement a treatment plan and then evaluate change over time. As I was saying, some clients might come in and they don't know what the problem is. They know that something's not right intuitively, and you're trying to figure it out. So you might give them a basic functioning scale or a well-being scale. When it's very specific, right, they're struggling with a learning issue, maybe it's a child who's doing poorly in school, and you suspect maybe there's a specific learning disability, then giving an IQ test or giving a learning battery can help narrow down where is the problem. Is it with reading? Is it with math? Is it with short-term memory or processing speed? So it helps us determine the problem. And many counselors make it a practice of part of the initial intake paperwork, there might be a form or two where a person fills things out, and that helps identify the problem early on and the severity of it. Determining the problem, right? So I can't emphasize this enough, and this is really where assessment shines, is that if you implement a treatment plan for an issue that the client doesn't have, it's not going to be effective, right? So I don't want to make everything clinical, but the case of bipolar disorder and borderline, notoriously the two get conflated with each other. And so if you make a treatment plan thinking my client has bipolar disorder, but they really have borderline, it's not going to be helpful, and vice versa. If you come up with a strategy or a treatment plan that addresses ADHD when the person really has test anxiety, right, it's not going to work. Or if someone has some social anxiety versus being incredibly shy, right? So it helps us pinpoint and define that problem. So one of my favorite counseling examples is with bullying, right? If a student comes in and they're being bullied, what do we mean by bullying, right? On the one hand, bullying does exist. It's a very serious problem. They're being teased and razzed and made fun of. Versus, is this a case where the client is actually just very sensitive and there is no bullying going on? So it helps us figure out what's happening by asking those clarifying questions. Has this happened? Has that happened? What was that like? As I mentioned, treatment and implementation. We want to pinpoint what the problem is so that we can treat it. If the person has an anxiety issue, then we treat for anxiety. If they have an ADHD issue, we treat for ADHD. If they're in a place, if it's neither of those things, maybe the person grows up in a really chaotic household and they're wound up and they're nervous because they have a insecure, attachment style or a chaotic home, well, then that's what we need to work on. So doing these assessments helps us determine, it helps us rule out what the problem isn't and keep what it may be. And then evaluation, right? Ethically, we should always be looking at, are we making progress, right? Ethically, we have an obligation that if we feel that we're not being effective, to maybe make an appropriate referral. And if they get to a point where we hope they would get to, where they don't need counseling, to let them know, hey, you have created the strengths and ability to manage this situation without counseling. So we use evaluation to see, are we hitting the benchmarks, are we reaching our goals, and to make adjustments as needed. So that's it. We're having a light first week. I want y'all to spend this time going over the syllabus and thinking of any questions or concerns you might have, getting familiar with Blackboard and what I've laid out. Look in the first chapter and pay attention to the reasons that we do assessment, how we define assessment, and sort of the history behind it. And I'm going to touch on that in the next module. I hope that this was helpful. If there's any questions or concerns, just let me know. Send me an email and I'll get back to you. I hope everyone's doing well, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.